By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the cell had already gone silent. No sounds of movement, no echoes from the hallway, just an eerie, unsettling stillness. Inside, a man was lying unconscious, his future uncertain. The incident was just one of many that would reveal the disturbing truth about America's most notorious federal prison, the ADX Florence. The facility had been designed to keep the worst criminals locked away, but in the shadows, something else was at play. As the years passed, the conditions inside became more extreme, more isolating, and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue, subscribe for more documentaries that uncover the darkest corners of the criminal justice system. In the early 1980s, the American prison system was undergoing a significant shift. The federal government began to realize that certain inmates, those whose crimes were too heinous or whose actions were too disruptive, needed to be isolated from the general population. It wasn't enough to house them in typical maximum security facilities. A more extreme solution was necessary. Thus, the idea of federal control units was born. The first such unit, the Special Management Unit, SMU, was established at the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, in 1983. Marion quickly gained a reputation as one of the most secure and harshest prisons in the country. This was the beginning of a trend that would reshape the landscape of federal incarceration for decades. Marion set the stage for what would eventually become the ADX Florence, but at the time, it was considered a progressive step toward containing the most dangerous offenders. Prisoners housed in Marion's SMU were subjected to extreme isolation. They were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, with little to no human interaction. The idea was simple: keep the most dangerous inmates as far removed from others as possible, reducing the risk they posed to other prisoners and staff. But the reality was far more complex. The conditions at Marion had a profound psychological impact on the inmates. Many struggled with the extreme isolation, developing severe mental health issues. But the authorities, who saw the measure as a necessary evil, were mostly concerned with control. The focus was less on rehabilitation and more on containment. Marion was a blueprint, an experiment that was set to pave the way for a more refined and extreme facility, one that would go even further in its isolation tactics. By the late 1980s, the conditions at Marion were starting to draw concern from human rights organizations. The level of control exercised over inmates, the harsh punishments, and the growing number of mental health crises all came under scrutiny. In response to these concerns, the federal government began to look for a solution that would give even more control over the most dangerous prisoners, those who, despite their time in Marion, continued to disrupt the system. The result of this search for a solution was the idea of creating a new, purpose-built facility. This would be a place where inmates would be cut off from the outside world entirely, a place so secure that escape would be nearly impossible, and where the consequences of any rule-breaking would be severe. This vision would eventually lead to the creation of ADX Florence in the early 1990s. While the Federal Bureau of Prisons had experimented with extreme isolation at Marion, it was at ADX Florence where the concept would be taken to its most extreme form. But the creation of ADX was not just about building a more secure facility. It was about crafting a new philosophy of incarceration. It wasn't just about keeping prisoners in their cells. It was about breaking their spirits and ensuring that even the most notorious criminals could not escape the mental and physical confines of the system. In the years leading up to the construction of ADX Florence, a series of incidents across the federal prison system made it clear that something had to change. Escapes, riots, and violent attacks by inmates served as constant reminders of the risks posed by the worst offenders. Marion's strict isolation methods had helped, but they hadn't been enough. The criminal justice system needed something that could take the idea of isolation even further. In 1992, after years of planning and design, ADX Florence opened its doors. Located in the remote foothills of Colorado, far from the population centers, it was specifically chosen for its isolation. The location was perfect for a facility designed to keep inmates apart from the world, and it was also a place where escape was nearly impossible. Built to hold the most dangerous offenders, ADX Florence became a symbol of the extremes the U.S. prison system was willing to go to in order to contain its most dangerous criminals. Once inside ADX Florence, The inmates would face a level of isolation and control that surpassed anything seen before. The prison's design ensured that every step, every movement, and every action was monitored. The cells were small, designed to ensure that inmates would spend as much time as possible alone, with minimal interaction with staff or fellow prisoners. In fact, the prison's entire architecture was designed with one goal in mind: to prevent any contact that could lead to the formation of alliances, to keep any group from gaining power, and to make escape as close to impossible as possible. As inmates were transferred to ADX Florence, the word spread. The prison quickly became known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a place where only the worst offenders were sent to spend the rest of their lives in isolation. Inside, the philosophy of control was taken to an entirely new level, and the prison would go on to house some of the most infamous criminals in American history, including terrorists, gang leaders, and notorious murderers. But it wasn't just the physical isolation that made ADX Florence so unique. It was the mental and emotional toll that the design of the facility had on the inmates. With little to no contact with the outside world, many began to deteriorate mentally. The extreme confinement led to an increase in suicide attempts, self-harm, and chronic depression. The mental health toll became a growing concern, but the prison's administrators were less concerned with rehabilitation and more focused on ensuring that the inmates would never again pose a threat to society or their fellow prisoners. Yet, despite the growing awareness of the psychological damage caused by the extreme isolation, ADX Florence continued to operate under its founding philosophy. Its methods were harsh, but they were deemed effective by those in charge of the federal prison system. The question of whether the costs, both mental and physical, were too great to bear was never fully answered. For the inmates inside, however, the consequences of this extreme isolation were clear. The early years of ADX Florence were marked by a growing recognition that it was not just another maximum security prison. This was a facility designed with one primary purpose: to break the spirit of its inmates. Unlike its predecessors, which had tried to contain violent behavior through strict supervision and isolation, ADX's design sought to eliminate any form of connection, any opportunity for resistance, and any semblance of hope. The process began with the meticulous architecture of the facility. Every detail was considered to ensure that escape was impossible and that communication between prisoners was minimized. The prison cells were smaller than most, offering only a narrow window, barely large enough to let in a sliver of daylight. Inmates were confined to these cells for 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour of solitary exercise in a small outdoor cage, where they were completely isolated. This was a level of confinement beyond anything seen in any other federal facility. At first glance, ADX Florence appeared to be an extreme response to the growing concerns about violent criminals. But over time, it became clear that it was more than just a containment solution. It was a symbol of the increasing willingness of the U.S. government to enforce a culture of absolute control. Its administrators were determined to send a clear message: those who entered its gates would never leave the same. Prisoners who found themselves inside ADX Florence had often already been through the federal prison system. Many had spent years in maximum security facilities where they had caused disturbances, incited violence, or participated in violent gang activity. These were not first-time offenders, but hardened criminals whose influence stretched beyond prison walls. But even for these individuals, the transition to ADX Florence was an experience unlike anything they had encountered before. Among the first to be transferred to the facility was Richard Reed, the infamous shoe bomber, who attempted to detonate explosives aboard an American Airlines flight in 2001. He became one of the early symbols of the type of prisoner ADX Florence was designed to house: individuals who posed a significant and ongoing threat to society. Reed's arrival set the tone for what would come to be known as the terrorist unit within ADX Florence. His presence there was a stark reminder of the rising tide of global terrorism and the need to isolate those who might continue to inspire violence even from within prison walls. But while the prison's reputation grew as a place for high-profile figures like Reed, its population soon included a range of inmates from notorious criminal backgrounds. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, another early transfer, was housed at ADX for his crimes of domestic terrorism. Kaczynski's long-standing evasion of authorities and his status as a symbol of anti-government extremism made him one of the most well-known figures to ever be placed at the facility. While these figures made headlines, there was a darker, more troubling reality unfolding behind the walls of ADX Florence. In the pursuit of absolute control, the mental and emotional toll on the inmates was becoming impossible to ignore. Many were showing signs of severe psychological damage, but the prison's design showed no signs of changing. The 23-hour solitary confinement, limited social interaction, and lack of meaningful human contact were breaking down even the most resilient individuals. Even the guards at ADX Florence began to question the ethics of the facility. The extreme isolation had led to a noticeable increase in self-harm, suicide attempts, and violent outbursts among inmates. It was not unusual for inmates to refuse meals, to bang on their cell doors for hours, or to engage in violent self-destructive behavior. The staff, despite their training, were faced with a dilemma: how to maintain control without exacerbating the emotional and mental breakdown of the individuals under their watch. But for the administrators, these outcomes were seen as an unfortunate but necessary part of the process. The isolation was not only a security measure, it was designed to remove any semblance of identity from the inmates. The facility had no programs for rehabilitation or education. There was no real opportunity for inmates to rebuild their lives. There was only control, and it was enforced with an iron grip. It didn't take long for the psychological costs of this approach to become undeniable. While some inmates seemed to deteriorate in silence, others fought back in desperate ways. A few attempted to escape, though no one ever succeeded, but the sheer scale of the facility's security systems ensured that such efforts were always doomed to failure. More than anything, ADX Florence had created an environment where inmates had nothing left to fight for but their own sanity. For many, the question became not whether they would ever escape the prison's walls, but whether they would be able to survive the psychological strain of living in such conditions. Some inmates tried to find small ways to resist, refusing to acknowledge their jailers, waging silent wars against the system. Others lapsed into depression, withdrawing completely from any interaction. One of the most alarming aspects of ADX Florence was the near-total absence of rehabilitation programs. Unlike other prisons, where inmates could take classes, participate in work programs, or engage in therapy, ADX offered no opportunities for personal growth or development. This was not a prison designed for rehabilitation. It was a prison designed to ensure that its inmates would never pose a threat again, not by reforming them, but by crushing their spirits. The lack of rehabilitation became a point of contention outside the prison walls as well. Human rights groups and legal experts began to challenge the ethics of such a facility, questioning whether the extreme conditions inside ADX Florence were a violation of prisoners' basic rights. The concerns were largely ignored by the Bureau of Prisons, whose goal was clear: to keep America's most dangerous criminals under control at all costs. Meanwhile, as the years passed, the world outside ADX Florence continued to change. The rise of terrorism, the expansion of criminal networks, and the increasing complexity of organized crime all fed into the growing need for a prison like ADX Florence. It became the go-to facility for those deemed untouchable by the rest of the federal system. Inside, the worst criminals in American history would continue to serve out their sentences, isolated from the world and from each other. As the years went on, the chilling reality became clear. ADX Florence was not just about keeping prisoners locked away. It was about making sure that, even when they were behind bars, these criminals could never again pose a threat to the outside world. It was the ultimate symbol of America's commitment to controlling its most dangerous individuals, no matter the cost. As ADX Florence continued to house the most notorious criminals in the United States, its influence within the federal prison system only grew. The facility, while designed as a place of ultimate isolation and control, was also beginning to serve as a model for other high-security facilities. Its extreme methods of confinement, though controversial, were viewed by some as the future of corrections in America. By the late 1990s, ADX Florence had earned its reputation as the most secure prison in the country. The facility's design and its ability to maintain near total control over its inmates had set a new standard for incarceration. However, this new era of control came with a price, both for the inmates who lived there and for the prison system itself. While ADX Florence was intended to house the worst of the worst, it was becoming clear that the facility was not just about protecting society, it was about punishing the inmates within its walls. The focus was not on rehabilitation or even containment in the traditional sense. It was about ensuring that inmates would never again be able to influence or disrupt the outside world. This philosophy of absolute control pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable within the American prison system. Inmates at ADX Florence were subjected to a level of isolation that most outside the facility could hardly comprehend. Their days were marked by strict routines, solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, 1 hour of exercise in an isolated outdoor cage, and minimal human contact. The cells were small, measuring only around 7 feet by 12 feet, and contained little more than a concrete slab for a bed, a toilet, and a sink. Even the furniture was designed to be unmovable and indestructible, making it impossible for inmates to find comfort or solace. Despite the prison's efforts to break the spirits of its residents, many inmates continued to challenge the system in whatever ways they could. Some resorted to violent acts of defiance, attempting to harm themselves or others as a form of resistance against the conditions. Others turned inward, descending into deep depression or mental illness as the isolation took its toll. The mental health crisis inside ADX Florence was growing, but the prison's administrators were resolute in their belief that the facility's design was necessary to maintain control. For those tasked with overseeing the facility, life inside ADX Florence was equally grueling. The prison's design, while effective in keeping inmates separated and secure, made it difficult for guards to build meaningful relationships with the people they were watching over. The atmosphere was tense, with a constant reminder that any lapse in vigilance could result in catastrophe. The guards' role was not just to enforce the rules, but to ensure that the overwhelming isolation never faltered. But the increasing mental health issues among the inmate population were hard to ignore. While some inmates were able to maintain their psychological resilience in the face of the extreme isolation, others began to show clear signs of deterioration. The number of suicide attempts, self-harm incidents, and violent outbursts grew steadily over the years. In response, prison staff employed a range of interventions, from solitary confinement to psychiatric medication, though these methods often only served to exacerbate the problem. Despite the growing mental health crisis, ADX Florence remained a cornerstone of the federal correctional system. Its reputation as a fortress of control and security kept it at the forefront of the conversation about how to manage America's most dangerous criminals. Over the years, more and more high-profile criminals were sent to ADX Florence, including figures like the notorious drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who was transferred there after his escape from another maximum security facility. His presence at ADX reinforced the idea that the prison was the ultimate destination for those who posed an unrelenting threat to society. While El Chapo's incarceration at ADX Florence was a symbol of the facility's power and its capacity to house even the most dangerous criminals, it also highlighted the limitations of such extreme isolation. Guzman, a former leader of the Sinaloa cartel, had spent years operating with near-absolute control over his criminal organization. His presence inside the walls of ADX Florence was a stark reminder of the lengths to which the U.S. government would go to prevent individuals from exercising influence, even from behind bars. The arrival of El Chapo was just one example of how the scope of the prison's population was changing. As time went on, ADX Florence became a catch-all for those who could not be contained elsewhere. The facility housed terrorists, organized crime leaders, and serial killers, creating a population of inmates so dangerous that even the slightest mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences. But even as ADX Florence continued to grow in infamy, cracks began to appear in its foundation. The prison's extreme conditions were no longer just a concern for mental health experts. They were now a source of public debate. The human rights violations and ethical questions surrounding the treatment of prisoners in isolation were becoming harder to ignore. Lawsuits began to emerge, challenging the conditions inside ADX Florence and calling for reforms. In 2003, the American Civil Liberties Union filed a class action lawsuit against the federal government, arguing that the conditions at ADX Florence violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The lawsuit claimed that the prolonged isolation experienced by inmates at the facility amounted to torture, causing severe psychological harm to those housed there. The case was eventually dismissed, but it opened the door for further discussion about the ethics of extreme isolation and its impact on the human psyche. Despite the legal challenges, ADX Florence remained operational, with its administrators steadfast in their belief that the facility was necessary for the safety of the public. However, the increasing awareness of the psychological toll on inmates began to shift the conversation. While the prison continued to be a symbol of ultimate control, questions about its effectiveness and its long-term consequences began to grow. As the 21st century progressed, ADX Florence continued to serve as a model for other high-security facilities, and the number of inmates subjected to its extreme isolation grew. But even as the facility expanded, it became increasingly clear that the prison system's reliance on ADX-style isolation was not sustainable. The mental and emotional costs of such an approach were too high, and the moral questions too great. The story of ADX Florence was not just about creating the ultimate prison, it was about coming to terms with the profound costs of doing so. The questions surrounding its existence would not be easily answered, but the consequences were undeniable. As the years continued, the debate over the effectiveness of extreme isolation would only grow louder, echoing through the halls of ADX Florence and beyond. By the early 2010s, ADX Florence was no longer just a symbol of ultimate control. It had become a central figure in the ongoing debate about the ethics of solitary confinement. As the prison's reputation continued to spread, its methods were increasingly scrutinized, both within the United States and internationally. Human rights organizations, legal experts, and mental health professionals had raised alarms for years about the psychological damage caused by extreme isolation, but ADX Florence remained a fortress, an institution whose very existence challenged the broader goals of the U.S. prison system. Yet, despite its global notoriety, ADX Florence continued to house an ever-growing population of high-risk inmates. Some of the most dangerous individuals in American history were placed behind its walls, including leaders of international terrorist organizations, notorious gang members, and serial killers. The severity of the crimes committed by those incarcerated at ADX justified its extreme methods in the eyes of many. But there was another narrative beginning to unfold, a narrative that would force both the public and lawmakers to reconsider the role of solitary confinement in the U.S. prison system. The human cost of ADX Florence was becoming increasingly evident. Inmates who had spent years in the prison began to show signs of irreversible psychological damage. Many were completely isolated, with only minimal communication with prison staff and little to no contact with the outside world. The lack of human interaction, coupled with the oppressive silence that enveloped the prison, had a devastating effect on the mental health of its residents. Psychiatric evaluations and reports from experts confirmed what was already clear to those who worked within the facility. The isolation was causing profound harm. Studies showed that prolonged solitary confinement, particularly the kind found at ADX Florence, could lead to irreversible psychological damage. Inmates began to suffer from symptoms like paranoia, hallucinations, extreme anxiety, and deep depression. Many exhibited signs of what mental health professionals called solitary confinement syndrome, a condition in which individuals became withdrawn, emotionally numb, and sometimes violent. The prison system's response to these issues, however, remained limited. ADX Florence's administrators maintained that the facility's strict isolation methods were necessary to keep the most dangerous offenders off the streets, and that the mental health toll was an unfortunate but acceptable byproduct. While these justifications held sway within the Bureau of Prisons, the growing recognition of the psychological consequences of solitary confinement began to make its way into public discourse. In 2011, a coalition of organizations, including the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Lawyers Guild, began pushing for reforms to the practice of solitary confinement. Their efforts gained momentum, especially after high-profile cases of inmates in extreme isolation began to draw national attention. Perhaps the most significant case was that of Khalif Browder, a young man who was held in solitary confinement at Rikers Island for over 2 years without trial. Browder's story, which ended tragically with his suicide after his release, became a powerful symbol of the dangers of prolonged isolation. His case was not unique. Many inmates held in solitary confinement at facilities like ADX Florence had similar experiences, albeit without the public attention that Browder's case generated. Browder's death sparked nationwide outrage, leading to calls for a reconsideration of solitary confinement practices across the U.S. prison system. In response to mounting pressure, some states and federal facilities began to reevaluate the use of solitary confinement. In 2016, President Barack Obama issued an executive order limiting the use of solitary confinement for juveniles and those with mental illness within federal prisons. This marked a significant shift in the national conversation surrounding solitary confinement. The acknowledgement that the practice was damaging to inmates' mental health was a breakthrough, but it did little to alleviate the plight of those still confined in facilities like ADX Florence. At ADX Florence, the debate surrounding the use of solitary confinement continued, with some pushing for reform and others staunchly defending the prison's methods. Despite the increasing recognition of the harm caused by extreme isolation, the facility remained operational, housing some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. Its existence and the role it played in the federal prison system remained a point of contention. As the years passed, the pressure for reform grew louder. In 2018, a report by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture condemned the use of solitary confinement in U.S. prisons, particularly for extended periods of time. The report highlighted the severe psychological damage caused by long-term isolation and called for an end to the practice. Although the U.S. government did not immediately take action to close facilities like ADX Florence, the international criticism added fuel to the growing fire of reform efforts within the country. Still, ADX Florence remained a cornerstone of the federal prison system, holding individuals whose crimes were so extreme that it was believed they could not be contained elsewhere. The facility continued to operate under the premise that the safety of the public, as well as the preservation of order within the prison system, justified the extreme isolation tactics used there. The philosophical justification for ADX Florence's existence was simple. The inmates housed there were a threat to society. Whether it was terrorists like the shoe bomber Richard Reed or criminal masterminds like Ted Kaczynski, these individuals were deemed so dangerous that the government believed the only solution was to sever them from the rest of humanity. But the toll on the mental health of these inmates and the moral questions raised by their treatment could no longer be ignored. By the 2020s, ADX Florence had earned its place as a symbol of the American prison system's most extreme practices. The debate over its methods continued to rage, but the facility remained steadfast in its mission to isolate, control, and contain. It stood as a reminder of the lengths to which the U.S. government was willing to go to manage its most dangerous criminals, and as a stark warning of the potential consequences of extreme punishment. Yet, as the calls for reform grew louder, the future of ADX Florence, and the practices it represents, remained uncertain. Would the U.S. government continue to defend the use of extreme isolation, or would the mounting evidence of the psychological damage it caused lead to a rethinking of the very foundations of the American prison system? As ADX Florence stands today, it remains a symbol of the tension between security and human rights, between control and rehabilitation. The legacy of its creation is one of unanswered questions and unresolved dilemmas, a legacy that will continue to shape the future of the prison system in America for years to come. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.